Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, and we're going to talk about college degrees. All right, so I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons and college degrees. I think I was going to say we're building a world. It's already built. I think we've built a world where the macro level Dungeons & Dragons player, the macro level Dungeons & Dragons player, the macro level Dungeons & Dragons dungeon master, the macro level D&D participant, and that is all players and all dungeon masters, are going forward at the 51% level. That's what I mean by macro. Are going to have college degrees. I think we've already built it. We already live in a world where I think 51% of all dungeon masters and dungeon players have college degrees. Right? Now, why do I think that? Well, it's connect the dots simple. Okay, let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Okay, let's talk about the page count on it. Right, there are 28 core rule books that are all canon. Okay, there's the three. There's the MMG, there's the MM, the PB, the PHB, and the DMG. Right, there are the utility books, Xanathar's and Tasha's. There are the adventures, right, like Storm King's Thunder. Right. There's the settings, Eberron and Exandria, right? There's 28 of those books. They're all 250 pages long, okay? One might be a little over, one might be a little under, but they're 250, okay? You know what that means? That means there's 7,000 pages of content for Dungeons & Dragons, okay? In order to even be fundamentally connected to the game, at the lowest level of participation, you must own all three books, okay? Or you're playing with your dunce cap on, okay? Which there is some of that happening, but I think that is outrageously prejudiced toward players, okay? So let's get into this, all right? So first of all, Dungeon Craft, Professor Dungeon Master, absolutely love his content, love his channel. He says some really, really wrong things. Recently, he's been spouting this nonsense that what we should do is, what if you have an unengaged player, right? Unengaged players cannot actually play Dungeons & Dragons, right? They're like, I want to swing my sword and have fun, right? And you're like, well, there's a whole lot of stuff you have to read. Like, you need to know about circle feats. You need to know about, fighting circles and feats and paths and all this stuff. And they're like, I just want to swing my sword and have fun. And I couldn't believe it. Professor Dungeon Master's like, if you got an unengaged player, right? We're not even saying, like, illiterate. We're not even saying low literacy or dumb, right? We're just saying unengaged. Person could be super literate and super smart, right? But they don't care about all the nuance, right? So Professor Dungeon Master says, oh, it's no problem. I'll do all their math as the Dungeon Master. I'm like, are you out of your mind? What? So you got the Dungeon Master and you got two players. Sarah's an engaged player, and every time and she's playing a wizard, right? That's another thing. He's like, well, an unengaged player will play a fighter, and then I'll do all their math, right? And Professor Dungeon Master says out loud that an unengaged player you cannot use them as a wizard, right? So first of all, how are you possibly going to do this, right? So first of all, Sarah's like, yeah, I'm going to cast Fireball because I'm a wizard, and I just looked it up in the player's handbook, and here's all the numbers, right? And then Dungeon Master's like, thank you very much. You just did 3d6 plus 7 damage, and you just, totally blew away that gnoll, right? And then Bob's like, I swing my sword, right? Now, first of all, how long is it going to be before Bob's like, so I never look in the book. Sarah's looking in the book constantly. I'm not wearing a dunce cap here? I am wearing a dunce cap, aren't I? Right? Like, this is outrageously prejudiced, right? Like, you can't have people who the Dungeon Master is doing all the math, right? The game has to invite everybody in, and right now it is not. And I think, and I want to say this clearly. I think we've already built a world where playing Dungeons & Dragons at the macro level, okay, there are certainly exceptions. I have a brilliant listener who I was shocked to find out did not have a college degree, right? Like, I was like, what? Like, that is very surprising, right? I was very, very, very surprised that one of my major commenters does not have a college degree, because he's sure, I'll tell you right now, I'm dealing with a dude every single week who doesn't have a college degree, and knows, and that dude, like, this commenter on my page has forgotten more about Dungeons and Dragons, than then somebody who I'm playing with who has a degree knows about Dungeons and Dragons, right? So like it's nuts, right? So basically we cannot. So it's connected.simple. 7,000 pages of content, 750 pages of reading to engage at the lowest level with Dungeons and Dragons, right? You have to ignore, right? You have to ignore the source books. You have to ignore Xanathars, and you have to ignore to keep it to 750 pages. You have to ignore, right? The utility books, the setting books, and all this. The reality is, the vast majority of Dungeons and Dragons players, and we need to admit this. We need to start talking about reality, right? The vast majority of players are reading 1,000 to 3,000, and a lot of DMs are reading everything. 7,000 pages of content. And to pretend that we have not built a world where a college degree is the bog standard minimum requirement to be a macro level, not an exception, but a macro level DM and player is ludicrous. Now, I'm going to say this right now. This was a mistake. This is a mistake. We have to fix this. It is wrong to build and maintain a game that requires a college degree to be a macro level player, to be a bog standard normal player. It's very, very frustrating, and I'm very disappointed. I'm incredibly disappointed that we've landed here. We need one book for Dungeons and Dragons that is PHB, MM, and DMG that is 99 pages or less, and I think we need to go to one book a year. Okay, it is outrageously unfair for all this to be happening, right? And so it's just my opinion, but this is where I landed and what I think, is the reality of the situation. The last thing I'm going to say is I already know there's some people down there saying you don't have to read 750 pages to play Dungeons and Dragons. You're wrong. I'll give it to you right now. You need the PHP. You have to have it. Okay. I don't think that's debatable, right? If you want to play if you want your player handbook that you spent $50 to actually be useful, then you need to actually buy the monster manual, because you can't play a druid without having the beast stats. Okay, so you need the monster manual, right? And then any player character you get is going to get a magic item. Magic items are in the Dungeon Master Guide. The idea that players should not own all 3 books is one of the most ludicrous, vicious rumor beliefs that exists in the game, right? It's ludicrous to bring people to Dungeons and Dragons and say, you should buy a PHB and you're not going to play druids and you're never going to know what your magic items are, right? And again, the only reason we land here is there is a ton of dungeon masters like Professor Dungeon Master who's just happy to hand out the dunce cap and say, I'm a genius, I can read all of this, but you could put your dunce cap on over there and I'll handle all the hard parts for you. It is outrageously prejudiced, and no game should be doing it. Every player at your table needs all 3 books. If they don't have them, they are substandard players, and they are certainly substandard Dungeon Masters. That's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.